Hey Sven here. Here I am again with my weekly build blog diary. It's week 19, 2026, and as usual, I'll tell you everything that happened this week. On Friday, I had the opportunity to give a talk at an event where I also shared the rocket routine story from the past 10 years. You can read about it in the blog as well, more or less. The very first blog post, so if you go all the way back on the blog page, that's the first entry, which mainly explains the motivation behind why I'm doing all of this in the first place. And as part of that talk, I also spent a few minutes showing the version that's currently available. Of course, the interface doesn't look the way I would expect it to yet. There's still way too much, isn't there? Information, for example, you can see 12 different metrics down here, and who knows what else. But basically, my main goal was to demonstrate a bit of what Rocket Routine is all about, what's behind it, and what I actually intend to do with it. And I want to show you this demo now as well, so you can get a brief impression of what the basic approach and ideas behind Rocket Routine are. Next week is going to be exciting because this weekend we're doing a complete code review. That's always really important in AI-based development because you can imagine if the software is supposed to be developed following a straight line, over time it always deviates a little bit. And that's why you have to make small adjustments every time, bring it back by doing a code review, fixing fundamental errors, and incorporating the insights we've gained so that in principle, it's kind of like a zigzag curve. It always deviates a little, then comes back, deviates a bit again, and then comes back again. So now we're going to do this complete code review of the entire code base and further stabilize everything. And in the coming week, we'll figure out what the user interface should actually look like. Because what you see right now, it's not really quite right yet. Cool. A window keeps popping up and then it's scrolled vertically. And honestly, I don't really like any of that. But whatever, for now, I'm mainly focused on the content. You've already seen some of these dialogues, so I'll go through them relatively quickly. So we have a dashboard here, and instead of checking your email inbox on Monday morning, you first look at your dashboard to see what's there. For example, which work items are open, which items do I need to review in my verification inbox, where do we stand with our key metrics, even though, of course, this can't really be displayed meaningfully yet. Absolutely, and it is important to note that you can seamlessly transition your view at any time here into the entire company strategy, the overall brand vision, and the core corporate identity. And there you can process all this data that is repeatedly used whenever I tackle any tasks in the system. And starting from this dashboard, I wanted to show how we generally proceed. Imagine you have an annual meeting, and in that annual meeting, you might review a vision. That's this here. And now, for example, you derive some annual goals from this vision, and then you might derive some quarterly goals from these annual goals and so on. Now we have an example here. So I want to have the first paying customers by the end of Q3 2026. And since it's Q3, the target date is September 30th. And I am personally responsible for it. And because that's a goal, I naturally have to consider, okay, how can I actually make this goal measurable with concrete results? And that's why I go here to the outcomes and then create a new outcome. And I could now have this outcome generated by AI, but for now, or rather not generated, but suggested. And I'll just enter it manually here now. And now I want to specify, what does this outcome belong to? It belongs to a goal. And this goal, for example, is these paying customers by Q3. And yes, so of course, if I say here by Q3, then I could also pre-fill that automatically. We'll definitely implement these little details as well. Yes, and then the question is, what is the definition of done for this result? And now, in principle, I would simply say, well, it's almost trivial. 3 different contracts with paying pilot customers. And of course, they also have to have successfully completed the onboarding process. What metric is there for this? So, for example, the ARR from pilot customers. I could also have these metrics suggested to me by AI, and then, for example, the system could recognize, based on the goal and the outcome, I would suggest that you might want to use the ARR from pilot customers. And we measure all of this on a quarterly basis. In this case, that might not make so much sense, so I would, for example, measure it monthly. And here I could now add an additional description, and then I add this outcome. And if I now look back into this strategic tree, we can see that this outcome is now, as defined, subordinate to this goal. And now you can imagine that the entire structure, from the vision down to the last result, is all visualized in this hierarchical structure. This will be displayed differently again. This tree structure is a bit too confusing and also hard to read, but the basic idea is what really matters here. At this point, so now from this idea, first 3 paying pilot customers, we have to somehow figure out how we're actually going to achieve that. Now, for example, I could go into the decisions here and say that this has already been prepared. For this pilot program, we want to allow open applications here, just like we're currently doing with this waiting list you can sign up for. Or do we want to approach 3 exclusive customers who are on our wish list? And all of this has already been formulated as text here. Option A, option B, need for clarification. And now I could do the following. I could consider, okay, if this is the fundamental question here, this decision, and I can't decide myself, then I'll first ask the decision moderator how this decision should even be made. The decision moderator is an AI agent who, based on this basic idea, now gives a recommendation and also explains what level of decision is this? So is it a leaf, trunk, branch, or root? I might need different people for that. And based on this entire construct, it also suggests to me how the decision should be made. So, for example, consultative would mean that I say, okay, I'll ask some other people who are familiar with the topic. Of course, I can override all of this and change it manually. And if I'm still not clear, then I can also ask my advisory board. So these are basically also so-called knowledge personas. And if I then ask them again, of course, it seems that I really should have already filled out this information properly, accordingly right here. I'll just copy it in for now. And now I'm asking this advisory board, and these are so-called knowledge personas. These could be, for example, well-known people who have written a good book on a particular topic, who are experts in a certain field, and who can answer such a question as a counsel based on their knowledge, for example, from their book. And whether these are such generally well-defined knowledge personas or whether they are, for example, more abstract ones, like CFO, CTO, CMO, and so on, it can be anything. Anything you might need for managing your company. It's completely open-ended, so the result is now available. So choose opt to be, targeting 3 exclusive wishlist customers. So that's the summary. Then there's, or rather, that's the short description. Here you have the summary of all 3. The perspectives of April Dunford, Jeffrey Moore, and so on are explained here in detail. And then you can also see what the individual knowledge personas have to say about it. I find that super exciting, and it simply helps us make decisions. This is just a primitive example, but you have to imagine if an AI agent is now responsible for making a decision, and if, based on its role contract, which I'll get to in a moment, it is also allowed to decide, then it's absolutely helpful for the AI agent to consult such a counsel, for example. And in this way, the decision is documented. That means even in 3 months, I can look up exactly what we were thinking back then. And now I just mentioned a role contract. Let's take a look at that right now. We have these AI operators here, for example, a marketing VP. And the marketing VP has what's called a role contract. And a role contract is much more than just a skill, for example, or a prompt or anything like that. And what exactly that is in detail would go too far to explain everything here. But basically, you have to imagine it like this. What is the purpose of this contract? For which results is it responsible? Well, for example, quite specifically here for the ARR from the pilot customers, which routines can it use? That means all tasks that already exist in processes, in other words, in repeatable processes, which are called routines here, can now be assigned to this role. They are then either added manually here, if there is a whole list, or automatically when such a routine is created. We just saw the topic of decision making. So if this VP has to make a decision that falls within the trunk area, then, for example, he has to get it approved. For a root decision, he has to escalate it. And perhaps he can make a branch decision autonomously and independently. And in this way, I can determine exactly what such an agent is allowed to do and what not. Which tools are available to him. For example, he can access all these systems that you use, the ones your company runs on. How much money is he allowed to spend per month for AI support, how visible is this contract? What quality tasks does he have? So, for example, can he perform a quality check of his tasks himself? And if so, does he need a peer review and so on? And here you create the checklist that he must follow and check off before his task is recognized as completed. Who does he have to report to, for example, to me, or with whom does he have to collaborate? And as for the upgrade process, this essentially means that if he consistently gets better and more efficient over time, then in the end, he is naturally allowed to do much more as well. And this is a very crucial and fundamental point to understand because we want to make absolutely sure that these agents don't get out of control in any way or at any time. Yes, and so when this specific AI operator has such a clear goal and such a complex task ahead of them, we must remain vigilant. And now, for example, is supposed to create a LinkedIn post for this pilot program. And for this LinkedIn post, there is basically already a routine, so he can execute this routine here. I'm showing this manually now, of course, because otherwise you wouldn't see it, you would only see the result. And this routine arises from a one-time task. You say, I want to teach the system how to create a LinkedIn post, should be created. If the result is good, then you can transfer it into the routine so that it eventually becomes repeatable. Now you can see here what the result is and what the quality report looks like. Now you see the checklist here. It's mostly green, but not completely, because one entry, namely this clear single CTA, is not good. And that's why it now says here, the result lands in the verification inbox for the CEO. That means I go into my verification inbox here, and now I see that this LinkedIn post has now arrived here. And now I say, well, if there isn't a clear, unambiguous CTA here, then I'll do this. Request changes. After that, please take a moment to carefully evaluate and verify the overall quality of the CTA. It is absolutely essential that it remains clear and provides highly specific information to the user. Once you are satisfied that everything is correct, I will go ahead and send it off, and you will notice that the item promptly disappears from my inbox once again. And if we now go to the control tower, we see that this LinkedIn post is now marked as in progress here. And now, the Vice President of Marketing takes full responsibility for the matter once again, and begins working diligently on this specific task one more time. And the very moment it is finally completed, it immediately moves right over here to this spot. The board, then it's in done, then it's in quality control. Looking right here in the history, we can see at the bottom of the interface, oh, hello there, we have now successfully integrated this specific entry into the history section, where you can see, please check the quality of the CTA. That means it now shows exactly what happened here. This means I can always track what has happened in the system. Let's take a look. The thing has now run through. I just refreshed it here because it doesn't update automatically yet. That will also be coming soon. And it's back in quality control. Well, and that's how it continues until I eventually say, all right, I'm satisfied with this result, approve it, and once it's approved, it can be posted. Yes, exactly. In this way, you can now imagine how the company basically operates. That was still quite a lot just now. It was manual, but as I said, I also wanted to demonstrate how it basically works. And now you can imagine if these agents can access their metrics and use them as a reference point. If the goals are assigned to the agent or to the person, that stays the same. We orient ourselves by the principles that are very important for making decisions. We have the routines, meaning all these processes that are carried out continuously. By the way, this intake scan here, totally cool thing. You go in here and this intake scan basically runs once a day in this specific example, and it scans all sources through which information comes in. So the email inbox, meeting transcripts, manually entered items. And this intake scan is then used to triage what happens with this newly received information. And then it is distributed accordingly throughout the system. Initiatives are then one-time activities, for example, this define pilot program. That is a specific new situation. And if this pilot program, if the way I completed this task, if that is now a candidate to be made repeatable, then I can convert it into a routine. That means, for example, an SOP is created so that it can then be carried out continuously. Knowledge is, of course, a very, very important topic. All of the company's knowledge needs to be gradually brought in here. These are documents, information, conversations, and much more. And This knowledge is exactly what the company needs to preserve, even if, for example, an employee leaves the company, so that the knowledge remains within the company. Yes, and learning. That becomes a topic when a result has been completed. And if we notice that the CTA is wrong every time, then we need to turn that into a learning, which in turn flows into the role contract so that the quality of the result is right on the first try. That's exactly what is especially important to me as someone responsible for quality. Yes, so that's it for today. As I already mentioned, next week, I don't know yet if we'll manage it in time, but maybe next week we'll already see a new kind of user interface, one that's just a bit cooler and easier to use so that it gradually becomes clearer how the system is operated, because in the end it has to be super intuitive and just one click. And then I have the information I need. I'm already curious myself to see what will come out of it. See you next week. Ciao.